Good evening, good evening, good evening. Thank you for joining me for my series Learning Through Literature as we continue to go through Perversion of Justice, the Jeffrey Epstein story. Preemptive trigger warning, this book does discuss intimate abuse. So, should you need to step away, please do as need be. If you missed any of the previous segments or you missed any parts of tonight, you can go over to YouTube at TazJ77 and watch it in its entirety there in the playlist under the same name, Perversion of Justice. Tonight, we are in Chapter 5, which is entitled The Miami Herald. The Miami Herald, which was first published in 1903, has a long, proud journalism tradition not only in Florida but around the nation as a legacy newspaper that fights above its punching weight. It has broken major stories of national and international significance. It was the flagship newspaper for Knight Ridder, once the largest and most progressive newspaper chain in the nation. At its height, the Herald employed more than 500 staffers in bureaus around the world, including Beijing, Jerusalem, London, and Buenos Aires. It also had a sizable staff at its sister paper, the Spanish language El Nuevo Herald, which has been a voice for Miami's Latin community for 4 decades. Over the course of its history, the Herald has won 22 Pulitzer Prizes and became known in the profession as a model in graphics design, color photography, and exemplary writing. It launched the careers of writers such as Leonard Pitts Jr., Dave Barry, Carl Hiaasen, and Edna Buchanan, to name a few, and served as an important stepping stone in the careers of countless journalists now at the Washington Post and the New York Times. The newspaper's coverage of crime in Miami, especially during the cocaine cowboy era of the 1980s, spawned many books and documentaries. Its famed newsroom overlooking Biscayne Bay was the setting for the 1985 movie The Mean Season, a thriller about a reporter stalked by a serial killer, and the 1981 legal drama Absence of Malice, about a journalist who commits multiple ethical lapses that implicate a Florida businessman in the disappearance of a local labor leader. Twice, the Herald was named one of Time magazine's top newspapers of the decade in the 1970s and 80s, and along the way, sometimes embarrassed the big boys at the Times and Post with major scoops. It was the Miami Herald that exposed Oliver North and broke the Iran-Contra story, winning a Pulitzer for its coverage of the Reagan administration scandal. The paper also broke the Gary Hart monkey business story, knocking the Democratic frontrunner from the presidential race when it was discovered he was having an extramarital affair. Remember when that would end a political career? The newspaper covered Hurricane Andrew, the McDuffie race riots, and the Mariel boat lifts, cataclysmic events that happened in the newspaper's own backyard but impacted the nation. While hurt by the efforts, while hurt by the effects of the internet on advertising, like newspapers everywhere, the Herald was still a robust journalism machine the year I was hired in 2005 from the Philadelphia Daily News, which was also owned by Knight Ridder. The Daily News was already feeling the loss of advertising, but Miami's hot real estate market reduced the hit to the Herald. I didn't really want to leave Philadelphia, but layoffs in Philly seemed inevitable, and I felt I had gone as far as I could go in my career at the Daily News. At the time, I was divorcing my husband of 11 years, a police officer who had decided to move to Florida because the state had a shortage of cops. I didn't want our children, who were then in elementary school, to be far from their father. My parents had retired to Naples, so I envisioned I would have a good support system to help me transition to a new job, a new state, and a new life. I was ready for a change myself and applied to the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Bay Tribune, as well as the Herald. I was offered a position at the Herald as an enterprise editor in its Broward County Bureau, located in the westernmost side of the county, a good 45 minutes from downtown Miami. The office was actually closer to the alligators in the Everglades than to Miami. So I did all the things you're not supposed to do at the same time. I got a divorce, I moved to a new city, and I started a new job, all with 2 kids in grade school. The kids and I moved into a cookie cutter house in a nice development on a lake in Weston, a sophisticated enclave populated mostly by transplants and retirees who all came from somewhere other than Florida. It was a typical suburb, but nothing like the suburbs I grew up in outside of Philadelphia. There was a true culture shock when one moves from the Northeast or probably anywhere in the country to Miami. Nobody can describe Florida and Miami better than Dave Barry and Carl Hyacin, so I'm not going to even try to begin. South Florida, in many ways, is the opposite of Philadelphia, so transient that as soon as my kids made friends, their families would move away. There's no real public transit system, so you're left on your own to get from point A to point B without getting killed by drivers who don't have licenses. People come to South Florida to escape, to retire, and to die, and before dying, they spend a lot of time lying in the sun and drinking alcohol. I call Florida the state of haves and have nots. The haves are all those people who live in waterfront palaces, drive fast, expensive cars, break the law, and get VIP treatment everywhere they go. While they donate to charitable causes, they would rather not mix with those who benefit from that charity, the have nots. The have nots are behind the wheels of Toyotas, Mazdas, and Ford pickup trucks, stuck in traffic at a complete standstill, while all the haves who can afford the tolls charged for the high speed lanes soar past them in their BMWs and Maseratis. Florida's wackiness, however, does kind of grow on you, and as a journalist, especially, is a gold mine, providing a never ending stream of stories that often garner worldwide attention and sometimes ridicule. There's always a Florida man or a Florida woman somewhere doing something that gives new meaning to stupidity. How ironic that Trump's main residence is there now. Hmm. Because of this, a lot of people who are native Floridians don't brag about being from Florida. They usually say they are from somewhere else. The only real Floridians, after all, are the Native Americans, the Seminole and the Macoski, tribes. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm struggling with words today, who were decimated by European settlers who arrived here in the 1600s. When most people think of Florida, they think of beaches, Disney World, orange juice, or fishing. I don't think that's what they think of. There are some truly magical, beautiful places across the Sunshine Ship. Across the Sunshine State, the Everglades are a tropical natural wonderland, and the Florida Reef is the only living coral reef in the continental United States. Central Florida is largely agricultural and has crystal clear rivers, natural springs, hammocks, and wetlands. One could get lost in nature here, and many people do, finding a slice of paradise in the middle of nowhere, living in a trailer on a patch of land, choosing to abandon most modern conveniences for a quieter life. Unlike Philadelphia or New York, the Florida sports fan is elusive because most sports fans who move here still root for their hometown teams. The year I moved to Florida, the Miami Heat made it to the NBA Finals. I would go to a bar to watch the game and have to ask the bartender to put it on the overhead television. When I took my kids to the Marlins Phillies game, there were more Phillies fans in the stands than Marlins fans. I know everyone tells me that this is a huge football town, but the Miami Dolphins have been a losing team for almost the entire time I've lived in Florida. I keep hoping, along with the rest of South Florida, that they put together a winning season. This made for a bit of journalism culture shock as well. In Philly, if the team won, the story was always on the front page the next day for one simple reason: it sold papers. In Miami, I would sit through the morning news meetings, and sports would be the poor stepchild in the room. I was pretty battle tested at the Herald by the time I got involved in the Epstein story. The editor who hired me, Patricia Andrews, told me always to watch my back because the Herald was a tough place to work. I know I did feel pretty chewed up between the pay cuts, the furloughs, and the inability of our parent company to find a path back to a more profitable journalism model. To that end, we were constantly experimenting with different ways to present and package the news, which meant we were on a never ending training merry-go-round. It felt like just after we mastered one particular computer program, the system would be tossed out for some new and improved interface. Journalists aren't fast learners when it comes to technology, or at least us veterans aren't. In fact, my desktop computer in the newsroom was so ancient that I put in almost daily calls to our computer help desk. It was unfathomable to me that a company that relies on computers to produce its content was so far behind that I had to wait 20 minutes or more to download a single lawsuit. As an editor, I helped less seasoned journalists develop in depth stories on their beats. Some people were born to be editors, but I was not one of them. I was too hard charging of a reporter to have the patience of a good editor. I think I've become kinder and gentler in time, mostly because I feel a little less scared that I'm going to be jobless and out on the street tomorrow. But knowing that editors were expendable and that the paper still needed content, I volunteered to return to reporting during a round of painful layoffs in 2009. Everyone was getting a 10% pay cut, but because I had volunteered to return to reporting, I was rewarded for my team spirit with a 15% pay cut. I had just moved into a house, which I was renting for $2,500 a month. I was supporting two children in a rental market that was among the most expensive in the nation. I remember screaming in the hallway outside the Herald's Human Resources Department the day they told me my pay was cut. I actually pleaded with Human Resources in agony, telling them that I had two kids to support, begging them to please give me the 10% cut that everyone else had received. I looked around the newsroom, filled with reporters who had spouses to help shoulder the burden, or reporters who were married with no children. I know they were hurting too, but I felt unfairly singled out. I didn't have any savings. Besides, I had put down all I had on the first and last month's rent and the security deposit on the house. I consoled myself by remembering that I still had my waitressing chops from my early years in journalism in case I needed them. I think you either like digging and doing research or you don't. I always likened being an investigative reporter to being a police detective. Part of me wanted to solve mysteries that even the real crime detectives couldn't. One of my first assignments when I returned to reporting was the murder of the heir to the storied Fontainebleau Hotel fortune. Ben Novak Jr. was found bludgeoned to death in a hotel in Rybrook, Westchester County, New York, in July 2009. His father, Ben Novak Sr., had founded the iconic Fontainebleau in Miami in 1954. It was legendary in the 1950s and 60s as a hangout for mobsters, royalty, and crooners such as Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. Ben Novak Jr., or Benji as he was called, formed a convention planning business after his late father lost the hotel to bankruptcy in 1977. He and his wife, Narcy, were holding convention at the Hilton in Rybrook at the time his body was found, half naked, with his eyes gouged out, in his penthouse suite in July 2009. The first thing I saw upon taking up the story was that Benji's mother, Bernice, an elegant woman in her late 80s, had been found dead just 3 months earlier. The medical examiner had ruled her death an accident, the result of a fall in her Fort Lauderdale home, but her autopsy was still being kept under wraps, which I felt was suspicious. If she had died of a fall, it was the bloodiest fall in history. There were blood spattered from inside her car, through the garage, the kitchen, and the downstairs bathroom. Her body was found in the mudroom off the garage. The medical examiner's theory was that she fell in the kitchen, then stumbled into the bathroom, went into the garage to try to drive herself to the hospital, then returned to the house in an attempt to call an ambulance, then collapsed and died. Who does that? It sounded ridiculous. I was convinced that she too had been murdered. But no one believed me, not the police and not my editors, who rolled their eyes at me and buried some of my stories. The Fort Lauderdale police who investigated her death got so annoyed with me for pestering them with questions about what they did and didn't do that they called my editors to complain. A few years before Ben and Bernice's deaths, Benji and Narcy were in the middle of a bitter divorce. Narcy hired a team of henchmen to pistol whip and threaten her husband after she had tied him up in their bedroom as a part of a sex game. What? That is not what anybody means by they want to go. You know what? The hired guns packed up all Narcy's belongings and emptied Benji's safe, and Narcy disappeared. It was Bernice who found Benji bound and gagged half naked in his bedroom. Oh, Lord. Fort Lauderdale police perhaps weren't paying much attention to the series of stories that I was writing laying out how Bernice may have been murdered by police in Rybrook, New York, but police in Rybrook, New York were. In July 2010, 1 year after Benji's murder, his wife, Narcy, her brother, Cristobal Veliz, and three other hitmen were indicted for the murders of Benji and Bernice Novak. One of the hitmen confessed to beating Bernice repeatedly with a monkey wrench. She was in her 80s. Could have popped out and said, boo. What? Investigating the Novak murders taught me a lot about good and bad criminal investigations that would help me when I returned a few years later to a new beat covering one of the most barbaric and corrupt systems in the state of Florida: prisons. I visited prisons from Florida's Panhandle to the Everglades, vividly documenting the inhumane treatment of inmates. There was Randall Jordan Aparo, a 27-year-old prisoner at Franklin Correctional Institution who was serving time for writing bad checks. He suffered from a rare blood disorder and had complained for weeks that it was flaring up. He was having difficulty breathing, but instead of treating him, the nurses scoffed. Aparo cursed at the nurses for not treating him, and corrections officers then punished him for his behavior by gassing him so much that he died in his cell from the fumes. Then there was Darren Rainey, who suffered from mental illness. Corrections officers, frustrated that he didn't obey their commands, locked him in a 180-degree shower where he screamed for more than an hour before collapsing dead, his skin peeling from his body. Jesus. Whew. Taking on the state's largest bureaucracy wasn't easy, and I was often concerned for my safety because dozens of corrections officers were fired or forced to resign as a result of my stories. A few of them were even arrested. More than once, I was awakened by prowlers outside my windows in the middle of the night. I knew what some of the officers were capable of, and they didn't have to do their own dirty work. All they had to do was pay an inmate to find some unsavory character on the outside to do it. For 4 years, I covered nothing but Florida prisons and inmate deaths. Each case seemed worse than the last. There were a lot of reforms that happened as a result of my coverage. But Florida's prisons are still among the worst in the nation, and each year the death tally of those behind bars rises. The fact that Jeffrey Epstein was spared the cruel and usual punishment that so many of the inmates in Florida prisons suffered wasn't lost on me. He had been sent to state prison Had he been sent to state prison, he would have entered as a convicted child molester. These criminals are on the lowest tier of the prison hierarchy, and most child molesters don't live long in Florida prisons and jails. They were raped and tortured so bad that they often commit suicide, are found dead of drug overdoses, or simply have an accident. And this is why I keep saying, stop trying to say that there was some big conspiracy to murder him to cover up for things. One, this man still had, as we learned the other day, multiple storage units with evidence and blackmail material in it, backup of hard drives, pictures, like the cachet that came out last year from his estate by way of his brother, Mark. If they wanted him dead, they would not have put him in the local jail when he had to serve time in Florida for those 13 months. They would have just put him in prison in Gen Pop. But Epstein's incarceration in the Palm Beach County Jail would be brief, and what little time he actually spent behind bars would be like a visit to a country club compared to being in a Florida state prison. And that takes us to the end of chapter 5. Tomorrow we will pick up at chapter 6, which is entitled Dead Ends. As always, thank you for joining me for this series, Learning Through Literature. If you missed any parts of tonight or any other night, you can go to YouTube at TazJ77 and get caught up there. As always, be kind to yourself and be kind to others. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central.